Hi there everyone, Lars here with another writer's take on D&D, brought to you by Camille's Harem. Not just a podcast for novice writers by novice writers, but also a YouTube channel by novice writers for novice writers, because writing is an adventure, it's more fun with friends. And while I've been working on monthly D&D specials, I've been repeatedly thinking to myself, I should just really dive into some of my own campaigns. It's fun talking ideas and theories and how it all relates to writing, but I've had my own share of lows and highs while playing D&D that have resulted in some amazing and sometimes cringy stories. And these stories have helped me in turn when it comes to sitting down and writing my own books. And with my most recent D&D video out being all around city campaigns and how you can use a city setting to develop a really great story, I figured it would be fun to follow up on that video with a story about my own city campaign that I ran. Now, I'm going to give you some background on the campaign, and then talk a little bit about my world building, the situation surrounding the game, and my own Dungeon Master style. Once I've touched on those things, it should give you a better understanding of how this story ran the way that it did. And then I will tell you the first chapter of this D&D campaign, the Gangs of Erralial. Okay, so for the quick background, I am a high school teacher, professionally. And my school does have a D&D club, and being a fan of D&D, I stopped by wanting to see how the game club was going. And it was a really great group of kids that was in there. But it got me thinking, there are way more nerds than this on this campus. And there are a lot of students who don't realize it yet just how nerdy they are, or they don't want to admit it to all their friends because, make them look so uncool. And I'm like, you know what? There's a whole lot more nerds out there. And I'm going to help them realize their nerdiness. So I thought that it would be awesome to throw out there for a whole bunch of students that there's an opportunity to play a very special game of D&D. Now then, I knew I wasn't going to grab every single student out there, but I managed to gather quite the collection of students from freshmen to seniors, some of whom had played D&D before, some who had never played D&D, some who really weren't all that interested in playing but had friends who were interested, and it ended up being a pretty big, crazy group. Now, I decided that I was going to run the campaign during lunch, and there was a reason for doing this, because the story that I had in mind required multiple small groups to all be doing things simultaneously. And I thought about different kinds of scenarios that they could run into, and I was really going to teach them and encourage them to do role-playing. And you're going to see how that all ended up working on out. And for a lot of Dungeon Masters out there, I can already feel you cringing hard in frustrations. You're like, why would you do that? You know you shouldn't have too many players all in one game. That's going to be insane. Also, when you have so many new players, you need to take your time. Don't do anything crazy. And yes, I absolutely do agree. However, I thought with the way I was going to simplify everything, it was going to open up more possibilities for younger players to really just get into the story rather than have to deal with all of the dice rolling, the math, and I was going to walk them through it, and that was why I wanted the lunch hour, so that way I could meet individually with each group that would come together and say, okay, you guys are going to be doing this kind of a story on the side, then I'm going to then meet with this group tomorrow, then with a third group then, and then like on Thursday or Friday we'll all come together and share out where the story is going. So that was my plan, as ambitious as it was. And as for the story, you see, I am a huge fan of Critical Role, specifically Season 2. And there is one thing that Matt Mercer just has not fulfilled, he has not delivered on, and that is the chair. There's a dangerous chair out there in the world of Critical Role, and it's going to get the Mighty Nine one of these days. But because Matt Mercer doesn't have the guts to follow through with the chair, I decided, you know what? For a campaign story, I'm going to have a murderous chair. And that is where things started finally coming together. I was going to run a murder mystery where everything led to the chair. So, I kind of let the cat out of the bag right there. I've kind of given away the perp, but the real adventure is getting to the chair. So, figuring out then, okay, so what's going to be the setting for this? And I actually really quickly threw out the idea of a large world setting, just because the moment that you put people into a sandbox, anything happens. And with a whole bunch of teenagers coming in to play this game, a lot of them who have not played D&D before, I knew that if I gave them too much freedom, they would either lock up and have no idea what to do, or the story would just fly completely off the rails. So, a city it had to be, because in a city I could, as the Dungeon Master, control more elements and hem the characters in a little bit more, so that way they didn't go too wild and crazy in their search for clues. I had also, previously, the year before, been working with another one of my classes on kind of an experimental D&D format for class. I'm a huge D&D nerd, what can I say? To say the experiment ultimately failed, but there were a couple of students who did get in on the earlier experiments, tying in lessons to crazy little side quests and stories, and a story did start blooming around this empire. And there was a really cool idea there, but once again, too big for this particular D&D setting with a bunch of newbies. So instead, I decided, you know what, I can keep some of the world building, but I'm going to put it into this city, the city of Erralial. So let me describe this city. The city of Erralial is at the most northern frontier of this massive empire. And normally that means it would be a rather small, unimportant city. However, it does end up being a very important one. You see, the nobility that resides there have worked very, very hard on making this a center for trade, as well as a hub for northern campaigns. The Empire has a very healthy slave market going. They need more slaves all the time, and they campaign against northern kingdoms and northern barbarians to bring in their slaves. So there needs to be a staging ground for the military. Where there are soldiers, there is money to be had. And where there are a lot of people gathered, there's a wonderful opportunity for trade. So the nobility of Erralial have worked very, very hard to cultivate strong trade connections, as well as a strong military presence. This has brought tons of people to the city and has allowed the city to grow. But there is also a little bit going on within the city that predates this venture, and that is that it is a very important religious and magical site. There are a lot of people who've been drawn to the city of Erralial for various reasons. So it has a very healthy religious community with multiple religions, cults, and temples within this structure. Now, the city itself is built on a hill, and it is built in a very interesting style. It curves like a seashell. So if you see it from far away, it looks like this beautiful white seashell rising up from the gray and green of the surrounding terrain. And it's very near a cove. Now, the cove has been artificially broken and widened to allow for more ships to come in. So there is a kind of seaside town area just outside of Erralial that brushes right up against the city walls. The city of Erralial itself is stuffed to the max with traders, with soldiers, with families, all different kinds of people in very vibrant communities. Now, there are people who also live along the trading route and along the military roads leading up into the north, but for safety during the campaign season, people come in close around the city. So there aren't a whole lot of people other than tavern owners, some farmers, some villagers who just want to get away, and the occasional adventurer who lives away from the city down the road. Otherwise, everyone is in the metropolis area. The city is also split into 3 sections going up. The bottom section is where you have the major residents and the trading areas, and the lower part of the city is also kind of separated into massive trade areas. You have the northern part of the city, which is dedicated to the slave trade. You then have the southern half of the city, which is dedicated to ironworks. You then have the western part of the city, which is dedicated to textiles and to fruit and trade and all that good jazz. And then the eastern side is dedicated to textiles. So that is kind of the residential, the working area. When you go up to the second level of the city, going further up the seashell, that's where you get to the religious district. And that's where all of the temples are, where the shrines are for the various cults, and where all of the residents for the religious community are. Just above them is where all of the nobility resides in their mansions and castles. Now, for a city that is this big and has a lot of stuff going on in it, of course there is going to be a lot of laws and a lot of law breakers, which means that there needs to be proper law enforcement. And this is something that I set up specifically for the players. There are 4 factions that they can join, 4 groups that have been tasked with keeping law and order within the city of Erralial. First, you have the City Guard. These are basically the local police, the people who, this is where they live, this is their home. They have a personal investment in keeping the peace. They have signed on with the city, and they are paid by the city to make sure that people don't commit any crimes, that the streets are kept clean, so on and so forth. You then have the Guild Guard. These are the guards that are hired by the various guilds that are present within the city, and they work together because even though there is friendly competition between the various guilds and different stores, they understand that it's very easy where there's a lot of trade for there to also be a lot of corruption. They don't want anyone messing up the good thing that they've got going up here in the north. So the Guild Guard works together. You've got different Guild Guard members who belong to like the Ironworks, to the Steelworks, the Goldworks, the Slave Works, so on and so forth. And so if the players decide to work with the Guild Guard, they then get the inside scoop on everything that is happening with the tradesmen. There are then the members of the Imperial Guard. These are people hired by the Empire. These are kind of the cream of the crop. You could also kind of think of them as sort of like the military police. They look over what happens with the military. Since there's a large military presence within the city of Erralial, it is their duty to keep the barracks in order and to make sure that soldiers respect the citizens and that the citizens respect the soldiers. So that way there's no funny business there. They represent the will of the Emperor and make sure that the Emperor's peace is kept throughout the realm. The final group are the mercenaries. The mercenaries have no direct allegiance to anyone except for the people who can pay them the highest coin. This is obviously the group that most of the adventurers want to be a part of because it allows for more freedom. However, this comes with a drawback. Whereas the City Guard, Guild Guard, and Imperial Guard all have access to various groups that can help them out and also funds within the city, mercenaries don't have that. However, mercenaries who are contracted by the city of Erralial to help keep the peace or hunt down criminals are allowed to act with way more freedom than employees of the city. So mercenaries can go dirty and they can get away with a little bit more. So that's kind of the payoff right there. They don't have the funds, they don't have immediate access to information, but they are granted more freedoms if they can prove that they've been hired by the city for a specific job. These were the 4 factions that my players could be a part of: City Guard, Imperial Guard, Guild Guard, or Mercenary faction. And what was awesome was I had students choose from all 4 groups, and it made for a really sweet dynamic, and it also caused some really neat tension there at the beginning because they all had their loyalties to different people, and they had to work it out. It made for some really great role-playing to see people from different factions talk things out and figure out how they could go about a certain job, sharing information that only they could get. It honestly made for some sweet role-playing from relatively new players, and that is what we love to see in D&D, because remember, D&D is a shared story building experience, and so when everyone can contribute something unique that is their own to the story, that is when everyone gets in on it, and that's honestly where some of the most fun comes from. Now, you might be still wondering, okay Lars, so you talked about a murderous chair. What's going on here? Well, let me tell you a little bit of the background for the story before we dive on into it. There is a chair that is possessed by an evil spirit, and this chair is being used by one of the gangs hidden within Erralial, trying to eke out a living amongst the 4 different factions. And they are using this chair to sow chaos among the citizens. So a chair is delivered to different families, and whoever sits in the chair becomes possessed by the spirit and goes on a murderous rampage. They leave a bloody scene. It's all chaos, And as the different factions try to figure out what on earth is going on, members of the gang come and retrieve the chair and make sure that all evidence is wiped clean. And then the chair is delivered to new victims. And by this way, many people have met an untimely end, and a very gruesome one at that. And yes, I honestly not only have made a killer chair, but I will admit this. I did go into this thinking it would be fun to introduce new players to a TPK, which I know goes against, once again, proper DM wisdom, because usually you want people to have a lot of fun and a victory their first time playing Dungeons & Dragons. That's usually what Dungeon Masters look for. I decided to try to pursue a TPK because I really wanted my players to get serious about dealing with a murderous chair. It would be a bucket full of laughs until the blood starts flying. Now, this does call into question what exactly is my Dungeon Master style. I will say this, I'm a very loosey-goosey Dungeon Master. I love seeing players get creative. Some of the best moments I've had in D&D is when players come up with solutions or come up with problems that you could have never foreseen. And it just makes it a whole lot of fun seeing how everyone reacts to the randomness. So this is something that I really, really wanted from my players. So as a Dungeon Master, I am usually very loose, even if it is a ridiculous idea, so long as it is somewhat feasible within the rules of D&D and they can roll for it, I'll let it happen. So I've let some pretty crazy things happen in my campaigns, believe you me. Nothing that has ever broken a campaign, but the kind of stuff that people look back on and literally years later are just like, I can't believe we did that. That was awesome. And so yeah, that's the kind of Dungeon Master I am. Loosey-goosey, I'm lax on the rules unless it is something that I foresee could break the campaign, then I clamp down on it. Otherwise, I want to see my characters get creative. And I, as the Dungeon Master, it is my duty to make sure that my players have fun doing what they're doing and that I provide them with proper story twists and with challenges that they didn't see coming, or that if they did see it coming, that I provide proper payoff. Okay, so that is all of the background information out of the way. Let me finally get into the story. So you see, there was a poor family. And indeed, I do mean poor. They were literally poor, but also very poor in the sense that they have all been brutally murdered. The city guard found their youngest daughter murdering the family with her bare hands, literally putting her foot through her father's skull. It was terrible. It was mortifying. It took 4 quarrels to bring her down. The city guard who killed her have never felt the same since. And this has been the 7th brutal murder in less than a month. People are beginning to talk. People are losing faith within the city. The campaigning season is coming to an end. The soldiers are coming home. And what will happen when they come home to a city in chaos? People are not exactly sure. What is the motive? Who could be behind this? But enough is enough. The city guard have decided that it's time to bring in everyone who they possibly can, and they're willing to open up their coffers to whoever can solve this mystery. And so, everyone has been hired. Anyone who is willing to risk life and limb to solve these gruesome murders has been called to this most recent site. And there, the city guard show the scene and ask for help. And this is where having a whole bunch of new players come in gets pretty hectic. I had to introduce the scene at least twice to my memory to large groups. Now, a lot of the players actually dropped out pretty early on. However, one of the things that is notable is that one guy came on in wanting to be that kind of a tool bench and tried to screw up the entire campaign for everyone. It was there on his face. I saw it. He came and he's like, I am here to wreck your campaign, Mr. Jensen, and I'm just gonna make it awful. Well, so I was like, I see what you're doing here, mister, and I'm going to have some fun with you. Never mess with the Dungeon Master. And so the scene was introduced to a whole lot of different players, and a lot of players decided to go off in different directions based off of what they found. One guy decided to check out the soup that the family was eating during the night of the murder, and he was like, it's time for me to go check the market and see if there was anything weird that was sold to them. went on off. Others were like, you know what? Due to the religious nature of the city, maybe they were possessed by a cult, so they went looking for cultist shrines in the area. And others are just like, you know what, we're going to go talk to the neighbors. Others said, what if we could use magic to divine what actually happened here? And that is where the tool bench got caught, because he was trying to mess things up. He was like, because something that some players will try to do to Dungeon Masters, if you're not aware of this, is that they will try to hide from the Dungeon Master elements of their backstory, so that way they can then pull it out later in an attempt to rob the Dungeon Master of the control of the narrative. Even though it's a shared storytelling experience, the Dungeon Master is there to provide continuity and guidance to the players. And there are those kinds of players that just like to tear that away. He was trying to do that by hiding special stats and hiding background information and everything like that. So I caught on really quick to what he was doing. So the city guard comes on in, and they say that they're going to perform a spell that's going to replicate what happened that night. And they're going to try to figure out, based off of the evidence that they can gather, what's going on. Now, this is a very expensive spell. They're going to waste tons of gems and a lot of gold on it. So it's something that they really haven't wanted to do. Well, this guy's here, he's caught up in it, and as they're using the spell, because he hid from me his special magical ability, well, they notice that there's some dark magic. So like, sir, you're going to have to come with us. And took him away. This actually ended up, weirdly enough, because this was just me kind of getting back at this player for trying to come in and just ruin the experience for people by being an edgelord and trying to be like, well, my story says I'm the bestest ever and I'm going to be in charge of this. It was, yeah, the guy left after I clamped down on his shenanigans right here. But it actually ended up opening up an opportunity for two other players who were like, wait a second, if there's someone evil right here, that means that someone has been tampering with the scene. And I was like, holy dang, I actually didn't intend for you guys to figure that out until later. And so they're already like, who could be up to this kind of thing? And so they started doing investigation checks. They started using their contacts, and they quickly found out that there were people who had delivered items to this family. They then went and they checked with other players who had been talking with the neighbors and had found out that there was this little moving group that had come by and dropped off some furniture. And they're like, oh, it was them! These people dropped off some stuff! And there was something that must have been cursed. So they went back and they checked the furniture and found out, lo and behold, this chair is magical. So they packed up the chair and they brought it on over to the city guard headquarters to check on the chair. Well, I was like, holy dang, they figured that out so freaking fast. What am I going to do? So I had to use some Dungeon Master magic to wave my hand a little bit and be like, the gang snuck on in and they stole back the chair. But now the gig is up and people realize there is a murderous chair on the loose. You got to go and destroy that chair. And so they started working together to figure out, okay, where could the gangs be? How are we going to corner them? And everything else like that. So things started progressing really, really fast. Meanwhile, some of the players who were going looking for the occult stuff found an ancient shrine that belonged to this entity merely known as Skull. This is just one of those instances where I, as the Dungeon Master, is all like, oh my gosh, these people are investigating totally the wrong thing, but I'm going to throw them a bone and just give them some interesting whatnot. It's like, it's Skull, it's this ancient shrine. And they started messing around with the shrine, and lo and behold, one of the characters, essentially without realizing it, created a warlock pact with an ancient deity known as Skull. So that's going to become a thing. Remember that for later on. Not exactly in this video, but trust me, that's going to come into play later on. Well, events are all moving. One of the characters is nearly assassinated for trying to go against one gang all by himself. So they all come together. All the players finally come together, and they decide that they are going to hit this warehouse area where the gang has been hiding out. And I was like, oh, this is going to be good. So finally I told them, look guys, this is going to be pretty big. We can't meet during lunch for this particular part of the story. It's time for a battle. They all knew this. And I was expecting them to just run in, swords flashing, magic blazing, and then I could spring my traps on them. Nope. These teenagers were incredibly brilliant. They saw through my plans. They cut a hole through the wall and attacked from behind. They went around all of the traps I had for them. They managed to attack the villains. It kicked off, though, this massive battle. There were tons of casualties, except like on all of the NPC sides. All of the characters worked together brilliantly to hunt down all of these gang members and slay them. Now, there were some golems involved, there was an elemental involved, there were summonings involved. It got crazy. It was nuts. And I bled this party down to their final hit points. And it was now time to bring out the big bad. They destroyed the chair. Holy dang, I was expecting to have like this amazing fight against the chair. Nope, one character set the chair on fire and I failed all of my saving rolls to save my glorious chair. No! That's just the way it goes sometimes as a dungeon master. But the chair was not the villain that they should have been paying attention to. No. There was an outcast drow necromancer who was there, who was the leader of these gangs, who had been pulling the strings. For what reason? They didn't know, but he showed up on the scene, and I had my moment. I could do my TPK. But because the players had just done so well, they had performed so admirably, they had thrown me for a loop, they had wonderful chemistry, they had wowed me with how they had managed to get through this entire battle so well that I was like, as the Dungeon Master's like, no, I'm not going to kill them. So instead, the drow showed up, looks around, sees what's happening, and is just like, well, crap. This is pretty bad. Takes one of his goons and vanishes. And I was like, well, guys, congratulations, you stopped the chair. And you've rid the city of some gangs and of this menace. Congratulations. And suddenly they were all like, no, that drow must die. And I was like, whoa, guys, you just turned my glorious one-shot idea into a campaign. And so I was like, guys, give me 2 weeks. I got a plan. And so from there, we went from a murder mystery hunting after a chair, some shenanigans that I wasn't expecting, to a full-blown campaign. And that is how the Gangs of Erralial begins. So, I know this is kind of like a weird little setup, like I'm setting up a story more so than actually telling you the story. So next time that I do a D&D episode here on Camille's Harem, I will actually go into the full story, character names and everything like that, because now the real adventure begins. So if you're interested in seeing where a bunch of teenagers and noobs to D&D go, please subscribe to Camille's Harem and click that like button and share with me also your own D&D moments down in the comment section below. I would love to hear them. I love talking D&D with everyone. And I just want to say, as far as writing advice goes, here's the thing. When it comes to honestly transferring D&D experiences on over to writing, here's the thing. Just like with dealing with that tool bench player who tried to throw everything for a loop, there are going to be times where you're writing your story where something is going to happen. Not to you, but within the story, where you realize, holy dang, it's not going to work the way I wanted to, and it will throw you for a loop. My advice is this: don't get mad, don't get flustered, but take your time and figure out how you can turn something that is a seeming disadvantage into a true advantage for your story. So like if a villain that you've been writing on the side suddenly becomes way more important than you expected, and you're like, I don't know what to do with this guy now, he's just too big. Well, you know what? Play that into your advantage. Maybe it will help you develop a really cool subplot, or maybe a really cool twist that you can tie in then to your main plot and your main villain. There's a whole lot of fun you can do. Just because a character grows beyond what you expected doesn't mean that they are now problematic to your overall plan. Or if there's a plot thread where you're like, I just don't know what to do with it. Trust me, plot threads are meant to be teased and turned into something amazing. A lot of the really great stories out there take threads that you totally forgot as a reader and turn them into something awesome. some like what we see, for instance, with Harry Potter. A lot of the early plot threads from books 1, 2, and 3 become very significant later on in the 7th book. You can do the same with D&D, and you can do the same with your own stories. Now, with all that being said, I gotta go on. There's stuff to be done. You've got writing to do. And if you're looking for more writing advice, please check out our other videos or our podcast episodes found on Podbean, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, the works. We also have writing discussions over at our subreddit and also over at our Discord. Links for all of those sites are in the description and on the channel page. And thank you very much for joining us on this adventure that we call writing. And until the next video, y'all, tschüss.